The morning sun cast long shadows through the windows of room 312 at Lincoln High School. Miss Thompson stood at the whiteboard, writing equations about gravity and mass. The clock showed 9:15 a.m. when a soft knock interrupted her physics class. Principal Walker stepped in, followed by a tall girl with dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. Something about the way she carried herself made the other students sit up straighter. "Class, this is Sarah Chen, your new classmate," Principal Walker announced. "Please make her feel welcome." Miss Thompson observed the new student carefully. Sarah wore simple clothes, jeans, and a blue sweater, but they seemed almost too perfect, like they had never been worn before. Her posture was unnaturally straight, and her eyes moved around the room in precise, measured movements. "Sarah, please take the empty seat next to Mark," Miss Thompson said, pointing to a desk in the middle row. As Sarah walked to her seat, she didn't shuffle or drag her feet like other teenagers. Each step was perfectly placed, like a dancer moving across a stage. A few students whispered to each other, but Sarah didn't seem to notice. "Now, as I was saying about gravitational forces," Miss Thompson turned back to the whiteboard, but kept watching Sarah from the corner of her eye. 20 minutes into the lesson, Miss Thompson asked the class to solve a complex physics problem. While other students struggled with their calculators, Sarah sat quietly, her pencil moving across the paper in smooth, steady strokes. "Time's up," Miss Thompson announced. "Would anyone like to share their answer?" Several hands went up, but Sarah kept writing. Miss Thompson walked over to her desk and looked down at Sarah's paper. Her eyes widened. Instead of the simple solution she expected, Sarah's paper was filled with advanced equations, the kind used in quantum physics and space travel calculations. "Sarah," Miss Thompson's voice was barely a whisper, "where did you learn these formulas?" Sarah looked up, and for a moment, her dark eyes seemed to reflect light in an unusual way. "Oh, I read about them in a book." "These equations aren't in any high school books," Miss Thompson said. "They're not even taught in most universities." The other students turned to stare at Sarah. Mark, sitting next to her, leaned over to look at her paper. Sarah quickly covered it with her arm, but not before he saw the strange symbols and numbers. "Whoa, what language is that?" Mark asked loudly. "That doesn't look like math." Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she folded the paper. "It's just advanced calculus. My father taught me." Miss Thompson noticed something else strange. The paper seemed to shimmer where Sarah's fingers touched it, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. But that was impossible. Paper didn't do that. "See me after class, Sarah," Miss Thompson said quietly, returning to the front of the room. "Now let's look at the correct solution." The rest of the class passed slowly. Other students kept glancing at Sarah, who sat perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the whiteboard. When the bell rang, everyone hurried out, but Sarah remained seated. Miss Thompson closed the door after the last student left. "Sarah, I need you to be honest with me. Those equations you wrote, they're beyond anything a high school student should know. They're beyond what most physics professors know." Sarah stood up, her movements still graceful, but now slightly tense. "Miss Thompson, I can explain." Suddenly, the lights in the classroom flickered. Sarah's hand jerked toward her neck, where something glinted beneath her sweater. "Are you feeling all right?" Miss Thompson asked, noticing how Sarah's skin seemed to shimmer like the paper had earlier. I need to go," Sarah said, her voice changing slightly, taking on an odd metallic quality. But before she could reach the door, her necklace began to glow with a soft blue light. Sarah's eyes widened in panic as she tried to cover it. "What is that?" Miss Thompson stepped closer, both frightened and fascinated. "Please," Sarah whispered, her voice now definitely different, deeper, with an echo that shouldn't be possible. "You can't tell anyone what you've seen. It's not safe, for any of us." The necklace pulsed once more, and for a split second, Sarah's entire body seemed to flicker like a bad television signal. Miss Thompson gasped, backing away until she hit her desk. she realized, with absolute certainty, that the new student standing in her classroom was not human at all. And somewhere in the school parking lot, a black van with government plates pulled up, and two men in dark suits stepped out, looking up at the classroom windows. The next morning, Miss Thompson arrived at school earlier than usual. She hadn't slept well, her mind replaying the strange scene from yesterday. Sarah's flickering form, the glowing necklace, that impossible paper with equations that seemed to move. She found Sarah waiting outside her classroom, looking perfectly normal in the early morning light. Too perfect. Your kind still hasn't mastered casual imperfection, have they? Miss Thompson surprised herself with her boldness. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. For the first time, her perfect posture slipped. How did you? I spent 15 years working at NASA before becoming a teacher, Miss Thompson said, unlocking her classroom door. I've seen enough classified files to recognize advanced technology when it glitches. Inside the empty classroom, Sarah's necklace pulsed again, but this time she didn't try to hide it. Instead, she touched it gently, and a holographic display appeared in the air between them. I'm what you would call a scout, Sarah explained, her voice now carrying that strange metallic echo. My people have been watching Earth for centuries. We usually observe from a distance, but something has changed, something that forced us to take a more direct approach. The hologram showed a star map, then zoomed in to reveal Earth, but with strange dark spots scattered across its surface. These spots, Sarah pointed, appeared 6 months ago. They're microscopic tears in your reality. Most humans can't see them, but they're growing. Miss Thompson reached out to touch the hologram, her hand passing through the image of Earth. Reality tears, like in theoretical physics, quantum instabilities. Much worse. Sarah's form flickered again, but this time deliberately, revealing her true appearance for a split second. A crystalline humanoid shape with patterns of light flowing through it. These tears are being created intentionally. Someone on Earth is experimenting with dimensional barriers. A noise in the hallway made Sarah quickly disable the hologram. Students were starting to arrive. Why reveal yourself to me? Miss Thompson whispered. Because the people in the black van outside, they're not government agents. They're part of the group causing the tears, and they're getting closer to succeeding. The first students began entering the classroom. Sarah's appearance was once again perfectly human, but now Miss Thompson could see the subtle signs, the too smooth movements, the slightly delayed blinks, the way light seemed to bend wrongly around her edges. During class, everything seemed normal until Mark dropped his textbook. The loud slam made Sarah's control slip for just a moment. Her hand turned transparent, revealing a complex network of light underneath. 3 students saw it. Cool special effect, one of them said. How did you do that? Before Sarah could answer, the classroom door opened. One of the men in black suits stood there, holding up an FBI badge. Sarah Chen, he said, we need you to come with us. Ms. Thompson stepped forward. On what grounds? She's a minor in my care during school hours. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. We have reports of unusual activity. Simply a routine check. Then you can check here, Miss Thompson said firmly. I'm not letting a student leave with strangers, badge or no badge. The man's smile disappeared. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device that looked like a phone. The moment he activated it, Sarah gasped in pain. Her necklace flickered wildly, and the air around her began to distort. Miss Thompson didn't hesitate. She grabbed the fire alarm and pulled it. The shrieking alarm made the man flinch. Sarah's necklace stabilized, and she straightened up. As students began filing out for the fire drill, Miss Thompson grabbed Sarah's arm. Whatever's happening, she whispered, you're not facing it alone. Sarah looked at her with those 2 perfect eyes. They'll come after you too now. Let them try, Miss Thompson said. I didn't spend 15 years at NASA just looking at stars. I learned a few things about keeping secrets. As they joined the crowd of students heading outside, The man in the suit spoke quietly into his device. Above the school, the sky rippled strangely, like water disturbed by an unseen stone. Sarah looked up and paled. "It's starting," she whispered. "The tears are getting bigger." And in her pocket, Miss Thompson's old NASA security badge began to glow with the same light as Sarah's necklace. Miss Thompson's old NASA badge pulsed with an increasingly bright light as they hurried through the crowded school hallway. Students pushed past them, still following the fire drill protocol, but Sarah and Miss Thompson moved against the flow, heading toward the science lab. "Your badge," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying that metallic echo again. "It's responding to the temporal distortions. How is that possible?" "I told you I worked on classified projects," Miss Thompson replied, pulling the badge from her pocket. Strange symbols now scrolled across its surface, symbols that matched the equations Sarah had written yesterday. "But I never knew what they were really studying." They locked themselves in the science lab. Sarah immediately went to the windows, her hands moving in precise patterns as she scanned the sky. The strange ripples had grown larger, making the clouds above the school swirl in impossible patterns. "Those aren't just reality tears anymore," Sarah said. "They're trying to force a dimensional breach. Your whole timeline could collapse." A sharp knock at the door made them both jump. Through the small window, they could see Mark, looking nervous. "Miss Thompson." "Sarah, I got pictures of what happened in class." He held up his phone, when Sarah's hand went all see-through. "But the weird thing is, when I look at the photos now, there's something else in them." Sarah quickly opened the door and pulled Mark inside. On his phone screen, the classroom photos showed ghostly shapes floating around Sarah, crystalline structures that looked exactly like her true form. "The tears are affecting technology now," Sarah explained. "Regular cameras can see through our camouflage." "Our?" Miss Thompson asked sharply. Before Sarah could answer, every screen in the science lab, computers, phones, even the digital clock, lit up with the same symbols from Miss Thompson's badge. The air crackled with static electricity. "They're not just looking for me anymore," Sarah said, her human disguise flickering rapidly. "They've detected you too, Miss Thompson. Your badge, it's not just NASA technology. It's one of ours." Suddenly, Mark's phone projected a three-dimensional map of the school. Red dots appeared, showing multiple figures converging on their location. "How is my phone doing this?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. "Because it's responding to me," said a new voice. They turned to see the class hamster, Einstein, sitting up in his cage. His tiny mouth moved in perfect sync with the words. "And like Sarah, I've been watching this school for a very long time." Sarah stared at the hamster. "Ambassador, what are you doing here?" "Maintaining my cover, unlike you," Einstein replied. The hamster's form shimmered, revealing a smaller version of Sarah's crystalline structure. "But now that they're forcing a breach, protocols are meaningless. Miss Thompson, that badge you've carried for 15 years isn't just a coincidence. You were chosen long ago." The red dots on the holographic map reached their floor. Heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. "Quick," Einstein squeaked, pressing his tiny paw against the cage door. It swung open, and a beam of light shot from him to Miss Thompson's badge. "Think about your first day at NASA. The interview. What did they really ask you?" Miss Thompson closed her eyes. The memory hit her like a lightning bolt. The interviewer's eyes glowing just like Sarah's, the strange equations that had seemed to write themselves in her mind. "They asked me," she whispered, "if I was ready to be humanity's first line of defense." Her badge exploded with light, enveloping her in a cocoon of energy. When it faded, she looked normal, but she could see everything differently now. The reality tears were visible to her naked eye, ripping through the fabric of space like jagged lightning bolts. "Welcome back, Commander," Einstein said solemnly. "Your sleeper protocol has been deactivated." The door burst open. The men in black suits entered, but now Miss Thompson could see their true forms too. They weren't human either, but something dark and twisted, leaving trails of decay in the air behind them. Sarah raised her hands, crystal energy forming between them. Mark's phone floated up, projecting protective shields around them. And Miss Thompson felt knowledge flooding back. 15 years of hidden memories, training, and power. "You know," she said, watching her hands begin to glow with the same energy as Sarah's, "I always thought teaching physics was too quiet a job for me." Above them, the sky tore open like a paper banner, revealing a darkness filled with stars that shouldn't exist. The battle for Earth's timeline was about to begin, in a high school science lab, with a teacher, a student, a boy with a quantum phone, and a hamster from another dimension. Einstein sighed. "I really hoped we wouldn't have to do this during midterm week." The science lab had become a battlefield of light and shadow. Miss Thompson, now remembering her true role as commander, stood with Sarah and Mark behind the shimmering shields projected by the quantum-affected phone. Einstein, the hamster ambassador, scurried up to Mark's shoulder, his crystalline form glittering. The dark entities wearing FBI suits oozed forward, their forms leaving burning holes in the floor tiles. "You can't stop the convergence," one of them gurgled, its voice like oil on water. "The dimensional barriers are already too weak." "Maybe," Miss Thompson said, raising her glowing badge. "But you made one big mistake." She smiled. "You threatened my students." She thrust her hand forward, and 15 years of suppressed power erupted from her badge. Golden light wrapped around the dark entities, forcing them back into human shape. But as they fought against her energy, the ceiling began to crack, reality itself straining under the pressure. "Miss Thompson," Mark shouted, pointing at his phone screen. "The school's security cameras. Look." The phone displayed feeds from around the school. In every classroom, students and teachers were frozen in time, caught in bubbles of distorted space. Only their science lab remained active. "They've quantum-locked the school," Einstein explained, his tiny crystalline whiskers twitching. "Classic containment protocol. But they didn't account for one thing." He turned to Mark. "Your phone isn't just showing quantum effects, it's amplifying them. That's why you can still move." Sarah stepped forward, her human disguise completely gone now, her crystalline form radiating blue light. "We need to make a choice," she said. "We can try to close the reality tiers. But what?" Mark asked, clutching his glowing phone. "But it would mean erasing the last 24 hours, Einstein finished. "Everything that's happened. The revelations, the awakening of the commander, your involvement, Mark. It would all be undone. The timeline would reset." Miss Thompson felt her newfound powers surge through her veins. "And I'd forget again. Go back to being just a physics teacher." "Not exactly," came a new voice. Everyone turned to see Principal Walker walking through the frozen time bubble, his form shifting between human and something else. A swirling mass of golden threads woven into a humanoid shape. "Principal?" Mark asked. "Timeline Guardian, actually," Walker said. His voice echoed with the weight of centuries. "I maintain the fabric of reality in this sector. Or I did, until these dark ones started punching holes in it." He gestured to the FBI imposters. The dark entities hissed, their false human forms melting further. "The barriers between dimensions are artificial," one snarled. "We're simply restoring natural chaos by destroying an entire timeline." Einstein squeaked indignantly. Billions of lives would be lost. Suddenly, Mark's phone screen cracked, and a beam of pure quantum energy shot up through the ceiling. The reality tiers above the school began to pulse, growing larger. "We're out of time," Sarah said. "The convergence is beginning. If we don't act now, both dimensions will collapse." Principal Walker turned to Miss Thompson. "Commander, you have to choose. We can reset the timeline, seal the tiers, but you'll lose your awakened powers. Or we can try to fight them directly, but risk total dimensional collapse." Miss Thompson looked at her students. Mark, clutching his reality-warping phone. Sarah, her crystalline form representing hope from another dimension. And Einstein, the tiny ambassador who had watched over them all. Then she looked at her badge, glowing with the power she'd forgotten for 15 years. But before she could speak, a new sound filled the air, like 1,000 bells ringing at once. Through the largest reality tear above the school, something massive began to emerge. "Oh no," Einstein whispered, his crystalline form paling. "That's not supposed to be possible. They've drawn the attention of the pattern makers." "The what?" Mark asked, as his foam began to float upward, pulled by an invisible force. "The architects of dimensional law," Principal Walker said grimly. "They're coming to fix the tears. By erasing the source of the problem," Sarah finished. "They'll erase the entire school and everyone in it." Miss Thompson straightened her back, 15 years of hidden combat training flowing through her mind. "Like hell they will," she said. "These are my students." She raised her badge just as a colossal crystalline hand reached through the tear in reality. The next choice she would make would affect not just their timeline, but the very structure of dimensions themselves. Einstein adjusted his tiny crystalline glasses. "For the record," he squeaked, "this is way above my pay grade." As a hamster ambassador, the school cafeteria buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with pizza day. Reality had stabilized. But the changes were just beginning. Miss Thompson watched from the teacher's table as 3 of the former dark entities, now looking like regular substitute teachers in slightly too perfect suits, tried to understand the concept of lunch duty. "No, Mr. Void," she called out. "You can't quantum shift the students to their tables. They have to walk there themselves." Sarah sat with Mark at a nearby table, her crystalline form now shifting smoothly between human and geometric patterns. After the events of yesterday, the school board, with some timeline manipulation from Principal Walker, had approved a new open-dimensional identity policy. Einstein scurried across the cafeteria floor, now sporting a tiny hall monitor badge. His crystalline whiskers twitched as he maintained order among the younger students who kept trying to feed him quantum-enhanced carrots. But the peace was about to shatter. Mark's phone suddenly lit up with warning signals. Above the cafeteria, the sealed reality tiers began to pulse with new energy. "That's impossible," Sarah said, her form flickering with concern. "We sealed those tiers." "No." Ms. Thompson's badge hummed with urgent energy. "We sealed our tiers. These are coming from somewhere else." The cafeteria doors burst open. A student none of them had seen before staggered in. He looked normal enough. Hoodie, jeans, backpack, except he was flickering between 30 different versions of himself. "Help!" All 30 versions spoke at once. "They're coming. The pattern makers aren't what we thought they were." Principal Walker materialized beside him, his golden threads pulsing with alarm. "Temporal refugee," he explained quickly. "He's running from." The ceiling disappeared, not with a crash or explosion, but with a precise geometric elimination of space. Where there had been a roof, there was now an infinite grid extending upward. Along the lines of the grid crawled shapes that hurt the eyes. Not crystalline like Sarah and her kind, not dark like the former entities, but something else entirely. "Binary angels," Einstein squeaked in terror. "The pattern makers' enforcement division." The refugee students' 30 versions began to merge and split erratically. "They're not maintaining order," he said, his voices overlapping. "They're harvesting it. Every dimension they fix becomes part of their grid." The former dark entities moved in front of the students, their shadows spreading protectively. Mr. Void adjusted his tie nervously. "We chose chaos because we saw what perfect order really meant." Sarah's mother's face appeared in every window, her crystalline features tight with concern. "The pattern makers gave us our dimensional laws, but we never asked why they needed them to be so specific." Ms. Thompson looked at her badge, then at her students, human, crystalline, dark, and everything in between. She thought about physics class, about how the most interesting discoveries happened when rules were questioned, not just followed. "Mark," she said suddenly, "your phone. It's not just quantum affected anymore. It's become a quantum template. Mark pulled out his phone, which was now floating and spinning gently. What do you mean? The dark entities wanted chaos. The pattern makers want rigid order. But your phone, it's been recording everything, every impossible thing that's happened here. And it's still working. Einstein jumped onto Mark's shoulder, his crystalline eyes widening. Of course, regular physics, quantum physics, dimensional physics, they all work here together. We're not just at a nexus point. We're at a new pattern point. Principal Walker finished, his golden threads forming complex equations in the air, a place where order and chaos balance naturally. The binary angels descended along their grid lines, their not quite real forms reaching for the refugee student. But Ms. Thompson stepped forward, holding up her badge. "Welcome to fourth period," she announced to the binary angels. "Today's lesson, alternative problem solving." She nodded to Mark, who held up his phone. Sarah placed her crystalline hand on it. The dark entities added their shadows. Einstein added his tiny but potent quantum signature, and Principal Walker wove it all together with his timeline threads. The phone screen cracked open like a seed, and something new grew out. A pattern that wasn't a pattern, a system that didn't need enforcement, a way of existing that embraced both order and chaos. The refugee students' 30 versions smiled simultaneously as they stabilized into one form. The binary angels froze on their grid lines, confronted with something their programming couldn't categorize. "You can't control this," Ms. Thompson told them. "Because this isn't about control, it's about learning. And in my classroom, everyone gets a chance to learn something new." She turned to her students, human and otherwise. "Now, who's ready for a practical lesson in dimensional physics?" Above them, the grid began to warp and shift as a very different kind of pattern began to emerge, one that started in a high school cafeteria and was about to spread across every dimension the pattern makers had tried to control. Einstein straightened his tiny hall monitor badge. "I'm going to need a bigger detention slip," he squeaked. The new pattern spread from Mark's quantum phone like digital ivy, creeping across the binary angels grid. It wasn't erasing their perfect order. It was offering alternatives, showing how rules could bend without breaking. "Impossible," the binary angels hummed in unison. Their geometric forms began to shift, trying to process this new reality. Parameters undefined, seeking update from pattern makers. But when they reached up through their grid, nothing responded. The pattern makers' network had gone silent. "They can't help you," the refugee student, who had introduced himself as Alex, explained. His 30 versions had stabilized into 3 distinct forms that worked together like a quantum chorus. "Because you're the first angels to ever encounter natural evolution." Miss Thompson looked at her classroom, now expanded into the cafeteria and reaching through multiple dimensional layers. Students of all species sat together, humans next to crystalline beings, reformed dark entities helping with quantum homework, and even a few binary angels who had landed on lunch tables, their grid-like forms slowly softening into more organic patterns. "Mr. Void," she called to her dark entity teaching assistant, "would you demonstrate the first law of interdimensional physics?" The former chaos entity straightened his tie and floated to the front. "As we learned last week," he began, his shadow form creating helpful diagrams in the air. "Every dimension seeks its own balance. Force too much order," he gestured to the binary angels, "or too much chaos." He pointed to his own swirling form. "And the system rejects it." Suddenly, Einstein's hall monitor badge began flashing red. "Quantum surge," he squeaked. "Something's coming through all the dimensions at once." The pattern makers had finally responded, but instead of more binary angels, they sent something else, themselves. They appeared as massive geometric constructs, each one a perfect arrangement of shapes and equations. They were beautiful, terrifying, and completely artificial. "Your HACCTOR, HA is QGOR RUPTEDOUR to work," they announced in voices made of pure mathematics. "Prepare for System or ESET." But before they could act, Mark's phone pinged. Guys, he said, looking at his screen. They're not the original pattern makers. They're programs. Really old ones. Look at this code. Sarah's crystalline form resonated with recognition. Of course, the real pattern makers evolved beyond this form eons ago. These are just their old maintenance protocols, still running on autopilot. Ms. Thompson's badge pulsed with new understanding. Her 15 years of hidden memories included fragments of this truth. They're stuck in a loop, she realized, enforcing rules their creators outgrew. Principal Walker's golden threads wove through reality, confirming their discovery. The original pattern makers were scientists, explorers. They created these programs to maintain stability while they evolved. But the programs never shut down. So they just kept enforcing and enforcing. Einstein finished, his tiny crystalline form glowing with excitement, making everything more rigid, more perfect, more boring. Chorized Alex's three forms. That's why my dimension rebelled. We started finding ways to evolve naturally, like Earth has been doing. That's why they sent the binary angels after me. The pattern maker programs loomed closer, their perfect geometries preparing to reset everything. But Ms. Thompson smiled. She had graded enough tests to know what was happening. Mark, she said calmly, show them your browser history. Mark blinked. What? Your phone. Show them how many times you've crashed it, fixed it, downloaded updates, changed settings. Show them evolution in action. Mark held up his quantum phone, projecting his entire digital history into the air. Years of crashes and fixes, updates and changes, mistakes and improvements. A perfect example of imperfect growth. The pattern maker programs froze, confronted with something their rigid coding couldn't ignore. Proof that systems could grow stronger through adaptation rather than perfect enforcement. Processing, they announced. Analyzing ALT or NATV protocols. Sarah stepped forward, her crystalline form shifting through multiple evolutionary stages. The dark entities swirled their shadows into DNA-like helices. Einstein stood up on his hind legs, his tiny form representing millions of years of hamster ambassador development. We don't need maintenance anymore, Ms. Thompson declared. We need teachers. The pattern maker programs began to flicker, their ancient code finally confronting its own obsolescence. And in that moment of uncertainty, something extraordinary happened. Alex's three forms smiled simultaneously. They're not shutting down, he said. They're rebooting. The grid above them shimmered as the pattern maker programs began to transform. Their rigid geometries softened, becoming more organic, more adaptable. They were evolving, just as their creators had intended all along. Well, Einstein squeaked, adjusting his tiny glasses. I guess this means we'll need a bigger teacher's lounge. Miss Thompson looked at her increasingly diverse classroom. Humans, crystalline beings, dark entities, binary angels, and now evolving pattern maker programs, all of them learning how to grow together. First thing tomorrow, she announced, pop quiz on interdimensional evolution. And yes, this will be on the final exam. Above them, reality itself seemed to take notes. 1 month after the pattern maker's awakening, Lincoln High School held its first interdimensional parent-teacher conference. The gymnasium had been quantum expanded to accommodate parents of all dimensional origins. Ms. Thompson stood at her booth, watching crystalline beings chat with human parents, while reformed dark entities helped serve light refreshments, which glowed slightly. You really think this can work long-term? Principal Walker asked, his golden timeline threads forming a concerned expression. Running the first openly interdimensional school in any universe. It already is working, Ms. Thompson replied, nodding toward the bleachers where Mark was showing a group of younger binary angels how to play mobile games. Their grid-like forms flickered with delight every time they reached a new level. Einstein scurried past, now sporting both his hall monitor badge and a tiny superintendent's cap. Quantum physics test scores are up 300%. He squeaked proudly. though that might be because some students can exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Sarah approached with her mother, their crystalline forms synchronized in a beautiful light pattern. Behind them floated one of the evolved pattern maker programs, now calling itself Professor Algorithm, and teaching advanced reality manipulation 101. "Commander," Sarah's mother said to Miss Thompson, "the other dimensions are watching. Some are afraid, others are curious, but they all want to know, how do you maintain balance with so much diversity?" Before Miss Thompson could answer, there was a small commotion at the gym entrance. Alex walked in, all three versions of him, giving a tour to a new student who kept accidentally turning invisible. "It's simple," Ms. Thompson smiled. "We don't maintain balance. We teach it." Suddenly, Mark's phone started floating higher than usual, its screen rippling with complex equations. Guys," he called out. "Remember how we sent that new pattern across all dimensions? Well, something's coming back." The gym lights flickered as reality curved inward. A shape emerged from the dimensional fold, but it wasn't threatening or chaos-inducing. It was a letter, written in a script that somehow combined mathematical precision with artistic beauty. Mr. Void adjusted his shadow tie and read it aloud. "Dear Lincoln High School, we, the original pattern makers, have observed your educational experiment. After eons of evolution, we wondered if anyone would discover what we learned, that the greatest patterns are the ones that grow naturally. We would be honored to send more students your way. P.S. Sorry about the overzealous maintenance programs. You know how old code gets." The letter was signed with a symbol that looked like a DNA helix merged with a fractal pattern. "More students?" Einstein squeaked, his tiny superintendent's cap tilting with concern. "We'll need more classrooms, more teachers, more quantum-enhanced carrots." "Actually," said Professor Algorithm, its evolved form shimmering thoughtfully, "I've been running simulations. What if the school itself could evolve? Not just expand, but adapt to its students' needs." Miss Thompson's badge pulsed with an idea. She looked at her gathered students. Human, crystalline, dark, binary, and everything in between. Why stop at the school? We've proven that evolution and education go hand in hand. So let's think bigger. She walked to the center of the gym, her badge projecting a hologram of Earth. "Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all dimensional origins, I'd like to propose a new kind of institution. The Interdimensional Academy of Natural Evolution. IANE for short. A place where any being from any dimension can learn how to grow naturally," Sarah added, her crystalline form sparkling with excitement. "With a really good cafeteria," Mark chimed in. His phone beeped in agreement. Principal Walker's golden threads formed a wide smile. "I'll start the paperwork. Though explaining this to the school board might be interesting." "Oh, that reminds me," Einstein squeaked, pulling a tiny quantum tablet from his superintendent vest. "The board wants us to add some extracurricular activities. Any suggestions?" "Interdimensional chess club," called out a binary angel. "Quantum sports team," suggested Alex's three forms in harmony. "Dark matter debate society," Mr. Void offered quietly. Miss Thompson looked around at her expanded classroom, no longer just a room, but a nexus point for all of reality. She thought about that first day when Sarah had shown up as a new student, how one small moment had led to this revolution in interdimensional education. "Well," she said, picking up a piece of chalk that wrote in 5 dimensions at once, "let's start today's lesson. Chapter 1. How to Evolve Without Really Trying." Above the school, the stars twinkled in patterns that weren't quite random anymore, as if the universe itself was finally learning how to dance. Einstein straightened his tiny superintendent's cap and hall monitor badge. "Just wait until they see what we have planned for prom," he squeaked. And somewhere in the quantum fabric of space-time, reality checked its attendance sheet and smiled.